Hi everybody, thanks so much for being here. We are super excited for this conversation tonight. I'm just going to say a few Raff related things first, and then I'm going to read 2 bios, and then I'm going to get out of the way. First off, that's over by the bar, that's Mike over there by the books, helping me out all night. Please tip them. Bar is open throughout. The only thing that we cannot do throughout is loudly grind espresso or steam milk. Anything that is not that is fair game. Bookstore's open. The very beautiful Healing the Liminal is over by the register, and I think Marcella will be signing afterwards, as well as some really cool original art prints of Marcella's that are also for sale over there that you can check out. And I'm just going to say a few riff-raff things that we have coming up, and then I'll stop. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. And so we're doing like our own little Valentine's Day type celebration. Right up here, we're gonna have 2 wonderful jazz musicians, a duo, Vincent and Sam, on trumpet and keys. They'll be playing all night, and interspersed there will be 3 readers, a poet, a nonfiction writer, and a fiction writer, Muggs Fogarty, Matthew Lawrence, and Alex Van Buren, all reading vaguely love or loss or anti-love themed work. And then there's events a lot of the days of every week. There's a few really cool ones next week. On next Tuesday, Grace Talusan, who lives here in Providence and teaches at Brown, is reading from her essay in an anthology called Snapshots about writing from photographs and conducting like a little sort of writing exercise on writing from photographs with everyone. Then on Wednesday, we're hosting a launch for a really cool book about Rachel Carson and the radical act of queer love. And the last one I'm going to say is on Thursday, so a week from today. Sophie Lewis is here for her latest book called Enemy Feminisms. She's sort of a really incredible radical thinker and writer, and we're super excited for that. Okay? And if you don't already, please follow us on Instagram. And when you run to go buy Healing the Liminal to get your copy signed, there's a little sign-up list for our newsletter if you are curious to know these things. Okay, we are here tonight for Marcella Kroll. Marcella is a professional artist, intuitive, and workshop facilitator. She's been practicing her gift since 1995. She works in private practice with clients all over the world and was a program presenter for the LA Public Library for 14 years, leading public classes for teens on tarot and other divination subjects. She regularly holds healing circles, guided meditation groups, and empowerment workshops for men and women around the United States, and hosts a podcast, Saved by the Spell. She's the co-author of Tarot in the Library Esoterica series from Tashin, and most recently, she's the author of Healing the Liminal, which we are here to celebrate tonight. And she'll be in conversation with James Vincent. This is an incredibly long and impressive bio that I'm not going to read all of. I apologize. Can I just read some of the names of the people who you've done makeup for, because I think it's cool? Okay. Lady Gaga, Florence and the Machine, Courtney Love, Amy Winehouse, Joan Jett, The Foo Fighters, Jane Fonda. That's it. I'm going to stop. Please welcome both of them. Give it up.
Where did my tea go? Hello. It's nice to be back. I was born and raised in Providence, and I try to come back often, but it has been a couple of years since I was last here. And it's my first time at Riff, and I'm so grateful that, James, you're here with me.
I grew up in Oneyville, so it's nice to be back on Valley Street. But I have been here for several readings, and I really love that space.
Yes, beautiful. Well, we're here to talk a little bit tonight. I love having conversations with you. I've had James on my podcast before where we talked about fashion and witchcraft and the impact of talismans and through makeup and items as protection, but in our wares and how we express ourselves and all of that. And that was really powerful.
Yeah, a lot of what I do in the beauty industry is around inclusion and representation. How are we working against the beauty myth? How are we decolonizing the beauty industry? And so the idea of the liminal, especially in spaces like beauty, which can be so empowering, yet so full of stress and angst and trauma for so many. Marcella has given me so many tools for kind of finding my voice in these spaces.
I'm glad to hear that. So this book is something that normally I write in a particular way where I've created divination tools, whether tarot or oracle decks or classes on how to magically empower yourself. This is the first book that I've written that is so extensively personal. It's almost a little bit frightening. I'm glad my mom no longer lives in Rhode Island because there's a lot of stuff in there that's probably not going to make her happy, but that's okay. So there's a lot of personal reflection, but also I went into my mediumship practice to write my ancestor stories. So there are stories in here that are parables or lessons, and they're written through the first person lens of each different ancestor. I basically wrote the first story, which is in the blurred timeline space. I wrote that on the Nile. I was in Egypt a couple of years ago, just after I actually came for my grandmother's funeral, and then I went to Egypt for a month to do magical initiations with a group, and wrote the first story. It just came out of me, and that I thought that's how I'm going to do it. That's how I'm going to write this book. So when I got back to Long Beach, California, that's where I was living at the time, I would be waking up at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning and I'd be like, who are we going to talk to today? And then record myself channeling this kind of in a trance medium state story, and then going back and editing later. So there are tools and exercises. The point of this book was I'm a person of many things, being a multiracial person, being on the autism spectrum, being someone that's never really fit in, and as a medium, having near-death experiences, I'm never really quite here or there. And I wasn't seeing any kind of work like that is expressed in whether it was in bookstores or the writing spaces or even in the magical spaces. They were all very centered on one practice or one type of person. And I really think that the premise of my work here is to create new things, not reinvent the wheel, not make a literary masterpiece, but to start the process of getting us to talk about these things. How do we find ancestor appreciation and reverence without appropriation, but also still honoring all those multifaceted parts of ourselves? And I couldn't find anything. I would go to the spaces and places where I blood-wise belonged, but was not welcome. But it still didn't mean that I had to disconnect myself completely and forget who I was. So that is, in essence, the premise of why this book exists, was to do that. So
you wrote in the introduction, I want this book to be a resource for those who felt neglected, unwanted, discarded, and yet are constantly called upon to be the rocks of unwavering support and resilience. I want to create a place of safety for those who felt like they didn't belong anywhere. And I thought that that was so powerful as I read through the book for the first time.
thank you. Yeah, that was, that in essence is where it began. And there is also bits of my personality in some of these reflections. I talk about my own receiving readings and them telling me I needed to write a book, and I thought that's hilarious. I think I have a God complex. And
can I tell a quick story?
yes.
Because I was telling it earlier. So I grew up in Rhode Island. I left a long time ago and was living in LA, went through a breakup, and just kind of was trying to figure things out. And a friend of mine gifted me some oracle cards, and they very quickly became a way for an indecisive person to find clarity in my morning mindfulness and my gratitude in my meditations. I bought everything I could. People kept gifting me these different decks of cards. I fell in love with them, and my ex in LA said, "You have got to meet Marcella, she is this most powerful person. You love her decks. And so I met her, and he said, oh, do you know she's from Providence? And I realized that I'd known her since we were teenagers. And for a shy, weird, queer little kid, if you know Marcella, Marcella was safety. She stood up to anybody. She protected everybody she needed to. And it was such a powerful thing for me to realize that this guide that was giving me such a gift to grow, to move forward, to find my next, path or connect to pieces of who I was this person who had been protecting me and so many of us in Providence for so many years. And even Matthew, who's reading here tomorrow night, also, when I said I was speaking with you tonight, said, oh, Marcella was always intimidating to anybody who was a bully. And I was like, she's still doing it. So thank you for letting me tell that long story. But to sit on the stage with her was such an honor to me, because you have been doing this work of making people feel seen and celebrated and included.
It's too early for me to be crying.
Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
No, thank you. I mean, it's also interesting because, I would have never known that. Never. Nobody sells you those things, that you're doing those things for them in the moment. So to, hear it reflected. And I find that often, I remember having an art show years ago in one of the upstairs galleries at AS 220. I lived there for quite a few years. I worked in the cafe. I worked many jobs in that place, and as Jill can attest. And I remember having these pirate flags that I made hanging up, and I thought, nobody cares. Nobody's seeing them. They're just whatever. And then it was 5 years later, someone said something to me about how impactful it was to feel seen by what they saw. But I'm so I really want to continue to encourage to tell people, if you're impacted by their work. Tell people if you feel connected or it's been relevant or helped you somehow, because also that would have been great to hear during that time of my life when I was nobody cares. Nobody's doing anything to, hold that space, and it was quite potent and quite powerful. So I thought maybe, maybe you could read a little something and then you can chat and then maybe read a couple of stories. Okay. Also throughout the book is my own artwork. I'll read you this first part, Bone and Blood, and then maybe we'll read one of the channeled stories after. So it says, your ancestors are supporting you even if you do not know their names. They are deep within your cells, bones, and blood, like an impression pressed into clay. In the same way film takes an imprint of a vision, stores it, and encodes it, the memories, mannerisms, fears, trauma, and love of your ancestors are encoded within you. Like a deeply programmed operating system, your habits and characteristics are your own. Still, those strange, often unexplainable knowings, fears, and cravings, maybe patterns of behavior or trauma, are all connected to your lineage. We often glamorize our ancestral line and make heroic mythologies of their existence, which is beautiful. However, that's how we survive, by telling and by remembering. However, while some of our lineage is admirable, we are all have some that are not, and we often tend to shy away from recognizing the ones who are unwell. There are both elevated and unwell ancestors, but we are often taught to forget the troubled and not so admirable ones, and glamorize and romanticize the rest by upholding the memories only of the elevated ones in an attempt to justify or validate our existence. Some of us live in shame and fear of those unwell ancestors in our lineages. It is often an assumption that we must feel immense guilt, anger, and shame to be worthy activists or allies as accountability for what our unwell ancestors have done. While it is true that anger can be a great motivator, it is not always the best tool when confronting those deep shadow wounds around identity, especially as shame can immobilize our healing journey. While I can't speak for everyone on this, I can only speak for myself as a multiracial person who has had limited success wielding my anger in my quest for belonging. I feel undeniable rage and upset when I think about my ancestors that caused direct harm or pain, especially when I know of the relatives, mine and others, who suffered under the painful and harmful acts of violence committed by my unwell ancestors. Still, I also know that I have my elevated ancestors within me. These elevated ones are here to help support my bloodline by creating healing and a sense of responsibility to heal any of the harm created by the unwell ones. It's imperative in this body of a multiracial person to dismantle systems that my unwell ancestors may have put into place and not to harm or further negatively impact future generations. Sitting around in a constant existential crisis will not help the current narrative or make a difference. I can feel pain and empathize, but I cannot sit around in guilt for what they have done. That also defeats the purpose of doing the work if I am making it about me and centering myself instead of creating a space of advocacy and healing. I think some people are motivated by guilt and anger, which is fine, but I know that does not motivate me. Personally, it only makes me not want to exist. This in turn perpetuates the cycle of erasure. When that guilt or shame takes over, I feel like a ghost haunting this place. I've often gone through many days and months of suicidal ideation because it feels impossible to exist this way peacefully. A lot of pushback will come in the form of others telling you you don't care enough, you don't belong, or you don't have a right to have a voice. These harmful assumptions bring a great discomfort in being perceived. They strike deep within the feelings of not belonging, being cast into the role of an outsider and feeling like an inhumane object. As a product of colonization, slavery, misogyny, power, and control, I often wonder, how do you take up space when you are continually apologizing for existing? I'm no longer apologizing for being here. I'm done with being tokenized for the purpose of making others comfortable with my existence. I'm done with feeling immense shame and embarrassment and abandoning myself. That is the whole reason why this reality exists. There's so much pain in this existence. However, that does not mean I have to live in this shame anymore. That does not mean anyone like me or who has gone through these experiences has to suffer. Not at this extreme. We can heal without suffering. It does not mean there will be no pain, but this is the invitation to heal without dragging ourselves through burning coals to make a point. We can create a new reality without toxic empathy and give ourselves the healing to move forward without martyrdom. While I spent a significant portion of my 30s and 40s focused on ancestor veneration, there came a time to release the belief that I could be fixed by connection or what some would consider an acute obsession with them. Acknowledgement of the past is crucial, but what does staying stuck in the cycle and stories of pain and redemption do to heal these wounds? I needed to get into the present and to live as a human being in today's world, not just a vessel venerating the pain of the past, not waiting for someone to permit me to feel validated in order to move on. I had also become dangerously attached to my identity as a person engaging in ancestor veneration. Who, I wondered, would I be without this mission? My ancestors had taken up so much space in my life, not just my benevolent and healed, uplifted ancestors, but my unwell ancestors too. They held on to me the same way that a possessive friend or lover would have, preventing me from making deeper connections with others because they relied on my purpose to bring them healing. Unbeknownst to myself, in pursuing my connection with my ancestors, I had stopped myself from being fully available for deeper, meaningful relationships. I had directed most of my energy to this practice of healing my family line, much in the same way that I might have used drugs or alcohol to fuel my escape from this reality. I created a false sense of purpose that was not rooted in the present, existing in the moment. I denied myself pleasure and instead lived in pain and shame and a never-ending search for redemption. So one morning, I took my ancestral altar apart to clean it and reassess the reality of my existence. I took all of the photos and names attached to it, placed them in a drawstring gift bag, held them in my hands, and I cried. It was a moment of recognizing them and my ability to be a good descendant. I made them human again. I was no longer putting them on a pedestal and thinking of them as gods that dictated my life direction. In those moments, I prayed to them and assured them I was not abandoning them. Still, the reality was that I could not uphold a fully actualized spiritual connection to them and live my life as a human while connected to their reality. The healing and wanting to belong that I so desperately craved had been in front of me for some time. But while I was fixated on my relationship to ancestors, I was not ready to see it. While I am forever grateful for the opportunity to be a vehicle and a bridge between my ancestors, I also remember coming here to this earthly plane to live. There is a distinct comfort in staying in the liminal when the physical reality does not seem to accept or understand you fully, and yet it is not your time to leave this physical place. I honor and revere those unwell ancestors with parameters that I have set. When I create time and space for them, I do not allow them to dictate my life and its direction. It can be hard to put yourself first when you've been told your whole life that you are selfish, and when you only just come to realize that the only people who called you selfish wanted to control you by minimizing your power, keeping your light dim, and not fostering your growth. There can be moments of resentment when you long for a life that could have happened. Had you received the support from the people around you, you could have been allowed to exist to empower them. But you must grieve those old stories, narratives, and potential timelines and return to the present from where you stand now. Then give it all of you got. And it goes on to offer some altar suggestions and ways to venerate with boundaries. And then it starts to move into the channeled stories.
I came back to this passage again and again. It's just the way my brain works. It just was like tugging there. You posed the question, how do you take up space when you are continually apologizing for existing? And for me, growing up here, multiracial, queer, in that kind of liminal space of not fitting anywhere, I think that some of the most powerful work that you do in this book is giving people permission to kind of explore things without perfection, right? Like Audre Lorde would call it like sister outsider, like how are we strengthening ourselves with our weaknesses? When you were writing this book, you mentioned your mom earlier, was there hesitation in sharing some of these stories or using your mediumship to connect to some of these stories and bring them forward? Or was the push to help other people feel included the biggest push?
Honestly, there was no I never thought I shouldn't do this. I've been kind of doing what I want for a long time, and in the sense of, even and maybe much to the chagrin of my mother and my family, they were very secretive about, we don't talk about those things, you don't talk about that, or, even the secret of who my biological father was, for years and years and years, I didn't find it until I was 42. And, but I've always been an instigator and wanted the truth, why? And so yeah, there was no, even though I kind of make jokes about well, I'm glad my mother doesn't live here anymore to see this book, because there were some things where, I tell the truth about, our relationship and the things that happened, but I would never shy away from sharing them just to spare her feelings anymore. I think I did a lot of that, trying to rescue people from my feelings, and making myself small. But then I moved out at a young age. I moved out at 16, and I had to fend for myself, and no one really there. I don't know. It's a combination of feeling completely terrified and then also not feeling like you have a choice. I feel like it's more important for people to feel held and seen than it is for me to be comfortable.
I also really was moved by the understanding of when you looked back at your ancestors and you said, I made them human again. I was no longer putting them on a pedestal and thinking of them as gods that dictated my life direction. I think for so many of us, especially those of us that grew up in kind of the typical Rhode Island families that we did, that ancestor veneration, that, push to follow in your parents' footstep, that dream to get that, typical kind of life was always so present when we were outsiders, from go. Talk to us a little bit, or can you offer some advice for people who might be saying, well, this is a real push for me to kind of take them off the pedestal and kind of really look at them as human and maybe look at their mistakes as human as well?
I think that's probably the hardest part, is one of the biggest pieces of advice whether I tell clients or anyone I'm talking to is, because we can be angry and have a lot of hurt and resentment, and everybody's always saying like, oh, forgiveness is the way, forgiveness is the way. Well, what if you can't forgive? So instead of saying, oh, I want to get to this place where I say I forgive them, I always say I look forward to the day where I can forgive them. I look forward to the day where I can have the empathy and compassion. By giving us that window of I look forward to it, it doesn't feel like this pressure to figure it out or die. Like there's this element of letting yourself have also your humanity with it and have your feelings and have it go through the motions, because one day it might be okay, the next day it might not, with all of them. Because people, and that's the other thing with this book about being messy and being new, things are nuanced and you're allowed to be fallible. I think we live in a society that doesn't let us make mistakes. I mean, people dig up, I think about half the things that I did or done, and I was like, oh my God, thank God there was no cell phone, there was no social media.
No cameras at baby head.
Yeah, no cameras at baby head. Could you imagine if freaking Insta or any of those clubs, or just like people capturing you, like the amount of things that I've done that I would be canceled 100 times over. I mean, a lot of people aren't allowed to make mistakes, and I think that's the most beautiful part of being human is, there are insidious, awful people out there, but there are people that genuinely just, they made a mistake and they have to do better.
I also think, maybe you all don't agree with me, but we have so much more understanding in language for who we are than we did even when we were coming up.
Even 10 years ago.
And so I sometimes look back to my grandparents or aunts and uncles and I say, they were on the spectrum. Of course they didn't know how to communicate, or they were orphaned at 12 years old. How do you know how to parent if you've never seen someone parent? And I think that gaining this new language of understanding of who we are also allows me to look back and say, well, hopefully maybe one day I will be able to forgive you for that or have the understanding. But the humanization, I think, is such a huge first step.
Yeah, and again, it's a practice. It's not something, you're supposed to get maybe the first time or right away. And I think giving yourself grace to go, okay, well, I can try it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be perfect. And just remembering the humanity of it all. Yeah. So, how do you find because one of the things I talk about in the book too is imposter syndrome. And you've worked with so many amazing people. Have you had moments of imposter syndrome in your work?
I think imposter syndrome is a funny term because I kind of feel like I've always felt lesser than but better than everybody at the same time. I feel like it's a gift. I feel like it's a gift of queerness. I look around and I'm like, is this what the Muggles are doing? We're this mediocre, And so I do think moving back to Rhode Island, it really has forced me to look at a lot of that. I fell into my life. I grew up in a poor family. I didn't have an opportunity to, take my time to figure it out. We just scratched and survived. And so there's a quote that I use with my artists where Aniston says, I'm misquoting, but had I not created my entire world for myself, I surely would have died in someone else's. And for me, I think that's what it's all about. So I didn't have time to have imposter syndrome. I had to work harder than everybody else. And my big breakthrough came with TLC and then Gladys Knight And I remember, and if you talk to the people I worked with at that time, they would tell you James is too hungry, you know. But I think the great thing about growing up as an outsider and the great thing about growing up poor, like what was the worst that could happen? You know, I was gonna struggle again. When COVID hit, my husband and I both grew up poor and we were like, we can live on beans and rice forever. Like we were locked down in New York City. We were like, we're so good at scarcity, you know? So I feel like the other gift that has come, especially from a lot of what I've learned from you, is imposter syndrome is ridiculous because who we are authentically is the magic, you know?
Beautiful. Yeah, I have to say, like, just in relation to Providence itself, you know, I feel really fortunate that I grew up here. Like, I always tell you, like, if I wasn't from here, I probably would have wanted to move here. Because growing up, especially like in the, I would say 90s, like early 90s, it was pretty lawless, like in the sense of you could really get away with doing a lot.
Oneida was the Wild West.
Yeah,
You never
like, I
knew
mean,
what you were walking into.
You really didn't. I mean, we would just do a lot of wild, especially creatively, and that was so, and that really kept me alive. Like art and magic have been the things that have kept me going, and the fact that I could, like, essentially live as an artist and be myself, and nobody, like, there was no third party in between that I had to work through to get there. Like, it was between me and my art. It was between me, whatever medium was taking shape, whether it was like, because I mean, I lived and worked at AS220 for years. I like played in bands. I did performance art. I did a play at Perishable. Like, you know, I've done a bunch of things, and all because it was like accessible.
AS220, I think, was an example for me at 15 years old.
Yeah, like going
You know,
in.
I was straight edge, so I wasn't the party kid.
Okay.
And nobody remembers me from when I was a teenager. I was so quiet. I had entire days where I didn't speak. Like, as an adult, looking back, I don't know if I had nothing to say or I didn't know if anybody was listening. But to have a safe space as a 15-year-old to go in and hear a punk show and find that tribe, you know, those people that supported you. I have built my life helping other people find community, helping other people find inclusion. And I feel like you kind of have done the same.
Yeah, and it just, you know, I do, like I said, I feel really fortunate because I wasn't gonna be like, I wasn't doing good at school, like math or anything like that. Like, I was like, what am I didn't know how to be except through expression.
Oh, I was a nerd. I was a total teacher's pet. I got A's all the time.
Oh, must be nice.
I'm a people pleaser.
I was cutting class and I did not graduate because I was very entrepreneurial. I was throwing raves at the Strand. That was my first club night, House of Leo. And then, you know, I went to rehab, and then I got a job at Club Babyhead. So I had the fast track to Party Monster, and I had no skills. But I feel really fortunate because it allowed me to be really free. And then I moved to New York, and I got my ego and ass handed to me, and then I was like, I am nothing, I am no one. And I completely disengaged from reality, and then moved to Los Angeles, lived in Los Angeles for 18 years.
Talk about disengaging from reality.
But the beauty of Los Angeles was it brought me back to my mediumship practice and tarot and astrology, whereas I did those things when I lived in Rhode Island, but it was in secret. It was in total secret. I had a double life because a lot of my punky art friends were like, shit's weird. Right? Like, you can hear the voice. You know, like, you're into some weird stuff. Yeah, I bet you went to Pyramid Bookstore.
What are you, a witch?
Yeah, you're some kind of witch. Ben the witch. And I had a double life going. I would take the train up to Boston. Anyway, in moving to LA, it brought back this kind of part of me and then it ended up being my work, my career. I didn't ask people like, how did you get into it? I'm like, I needed to eat. You know, I needed to, and it just evolved from there. But one of the most insane kind of comings of this book and everything of it is me doing the practices. Like I said, there's some exercises in here where I use my creative practice to develop ways to connect to your ancestors. And through my own firsthand experience, doing these practices and then my own hyper fixation research brain found my biological father, which the story isn't in the book, but I think it's relevant. So my mom was a party monster, and in the 70s, she had me, she had someone before me, but she never knew who my dad was, or she never said she knew who it was. And then I started doing these venerations, and I'd looked for years and years, no such luck. And through the ancestor tree that's in the book, the exercise in there, within 5 days, I started getting contacted by all these relatives, and they were like, "Who are you?" I'm like, "I don't know, who are you?" And then we found, apparently he lived in Hartford Avenue projects. My mom hung out, she used to babysit in there. That was my dad. And he got in trouble in a very Rhode Island way. He was a teenager, and the good folks up on Federal Hill, well, like, you know, some connected people used to love to, because they knew my family, and then they would hire kids from the projects to do jobs for them. So they hired him, he was 16, my biological father at the time, seeing my mother. They hired him to do a job. He burned down some 30-year-old guy's garage and beat him up, got arrested. And the judge was like, well, you can either get tried as an adult and go to the ACI, or you can go to the military when you turn 17. He chose the military. And he left Rhode Island and he never came back. And over the years, a lot of our relatives were kind of scattered off. And I actually found out I worked at Babyhead, and then one of my cousins ended up being a bouncer at Jerky's, and I didn't know it. So we actually worked together. And then all these people started coming in out of the woodwork, and then I found my dad, and he was in Colorado Springs, an hour away from the store that I kept getting asked to teach at in Denver, which I thought was really wild. So, and then through that, I found out my great-grandfather had a jazz club in town. There's a lot of wild history and stories, and my great-grandparents had a furniture store on Westminster in 1930s, right? And they were like one of the first established Black families, but then we later found out that they were also indigenous, Afro-indigenous, and disenrolled. So there's a lot of these, it's just the way the census worked, and yeah, so there's been a lot of history here. And I'm telling you kind of like the outer stories and not the inner stories, but
there's, I think for me, the powerful piece in this book was things that I had never shared with people the way I grew up, our stories in my family. They felt so woven into my life. And I think that a lot of people who have lived here and understand the quirky coolness of Providence and the power, you know, and the magic that this place has kind of been, will find that in the book. And you say, the act of existing as yourself brings forth energy. It allows others to be more in harmony because it enables others to do the same. And I found that such a powerful statement.
thank you. I think it's, the more you are yourself, the more you can be, you know? Giving others permission to do the same. So, I don't want to keep you all too much longer. Without maybe I read a story, one of the short stories, and let you explore the book yourself. I'm trying to decide between the dragon and butterfly maiden. So, what are you feeling?
Dragon. The dragon story is really powerful.
Okay, well, and the dragon story has to do with my great-grandfather, so it is very rooted in Providence history. Okay. My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. Okay. And then, I guess, then we'll call it, unless you have
do some Q&A, yeah?
Okay. So, the dragon. Arthur was often told he was a lot. Too loud, too intense, too angry, too emotional, too quiet, just too damn much. He did not know that he was a dragon in human form. He was much too large to be contained in such a small body. He was filled with magic. He could make things happen almost instantaneously with his imagination. Imagine living your life one way, visible on the outside, but feeling something different inside. Perhaps this contradiction was why he was constantly hurting others with his words, his outsized reactions, his unimaginable strength. It was usually unintentional. However, the wounds he had inflicted by rejection and discomfort got the best of him as he got older. His anger often turned to implacable rage. In his childhood, he was picked on by his father and older siblings. When he could not receive love or encouragement for his abilities, he felt resentment and threw tantrums. His mother would scold him and tell him to man up, as she didn't have time for coddling and the pain would grow. During early adolescence, the only remedy for Arthur was to escape. He found it in music, jazz, and more specifically, Algiers jazz. He could not feel any discomfort while listening. The knots in his heart would just dissolve and melt away. Music had the medicine he needed. It was as healing as the touch of a woman, but music never told him he was too much or not enough. He daydreamed that he would open his own jazz club when he got old enough, a place where everyone who felt orphaned by God or their families could come. Let the music heal them. First, he would have to ensure he lived long enough to see that through. It's challenging enough being a dragon, but being an Afro-Indigenous man in the 1930s was bullshit. You may have had wisdom and you may have kept your power and your freedom, but you'd still be treated like dirt under someone else's shoe. He saw it daily at his father's furniture store. It would make him furious to see his father's pride in having a business, all while his customers talked down to him. How could he possibly be proud after the government documented his whole family as colored when they were so proud to be indigenous? Apparently they weren't Indian enough. They weren't welcome in those communities either, and it was easier to pass in those days by whatever the census called you than fight the bureaucracy and politics of any government. Arthur could not abide by it. He could not understand the sacrifices his parents made to raise 11 children. All he saw was the disrespect and erasure of their culture as they tried desperately to make it in a white man's world. He wasn't quiet about it either, which often got him into trouble. As he got older, he got more disgusted with the fake politeness of the people around him, feigning kindness while their disrespect was apparent. He had a reputation for being a hothead, impulsive, and a ladies' man, and yet his ability to manifest was unmatched, even off the charts. His dragon-sized imagination still worked without fail into adulthood, and he could still make things happen so quickly that people believed in his power. But he was often too impatient to deal with the complexities of having manners, and he resisted any rules that presumed to keep him in check. So Arthur said fuck it to the family business and found other means to get by. Usually they were illegal, and they often involved petty theft. But what started off small grew over time. The crimes began to escalate to burglary, robbery, and selling stolen property. There were times when he saw no harm in taking from the more fortunate, justifying it to himself by saying that he was simply trying to survive. He didn't like doing time, but he didn't mind going to jail for a few months if necessary. Sure enough, he'd be out in no time and even get a little respect for being incarcerated. After spending a few stints in the joint, he finally saved enough cash to go in on his first nightclub. Finally, he had it, the place he dreamed of, which could offer respite from the hostile world. He found a business partner, an investor, and the only white man he trusted, no small feat, who was another neighborhood black sheep with a family. This club was the spot they would take and claim as their own. Jazz and cigar smoke filled the air, and the sweet smell of whiskey and perfumed women made all of Arthur's senses stand at attention. This moment was freedom, and this is what peace for his fiery spirit looked and felt like. He was smart, he was on top of the world, and nothing could stop him. But Lord, oh Lord, did he lose all sense when a pretty woman was around. Not only did Mabel capture his attention with her looks, but the faraway feeling in her large, sad eyes was something he recognized, a pain he felt without being struck. It was more than familiar, it felt like home. Mabel was wild and free, not bound by constructs of society. She lost her mother Sadie at a young age and never knew who her father was. She was not only independent, she could not be controlled. She also saw things that most don't in this living world. She walked between the realms of the physical and the spiritual, and Arthur was a beacon in the darkness she felt she was constantly navigating. A knight in a shining suit, smelling of cigarettes and intrigue. She wasn't afraid of him or his fire. If anything, she was drawn to him, his magic, prowess, and power. It was like for the first time, the awe-inspiring in each of them was revealed, and neither was intimidated or turned away from it. Arthur's larger-than-life energy made her feel seen, like anything was possible. They fell in lust at first sight and slipped into fantasy so fast that they would forget it was still illegal for interracial marriages to exist. They found a new reality awaiting them not more than 6 short months after falling for each other. Mabel was only 17 then, and she was punished for her actions by being sent to an asylum. She was pregnant with Arthur's child and had visions of the dead. Her guardians were convinced she was possessed by the devil and would not stand for it. They sent her away immediately to have the baby alone in a home for wayward girls. Arthur was not allowed to be a part of her life at this time, and during those months he also forgot that he was capable of being faithful. He escaped reality again by drowning himself in drink and running around with multiple women. It was sad, but even more tragic for the baby who was left in the asylum and designated an inmate at birth. We would hope that this love story had a happy ending and that our dragon found a way to rescue his love and raise their baby, but fairy tales are just that. Reeling from the loss of this connection in his life and thrust back into a society that starved him of human empathy, the wounded dragon could not even begin to work through the tidal waves of emotions he was feeling. It wasn't appropriate during those days for a man, let alone a person of color, to express his feelings, to show his vulnerability. He had to hide all he felt, and he became consumed by rage, anger, confusion, and abandonment. He felt betrayed by the very acts of love that once gave him a reason to enjoy life. Arthur blew up everything around him, and nothing remained but the ashes of what once brought him joy. In a full-blown, fire-breathing meltdown, he set his world ablaze and burned just about every bridge. He drank himself into a stupor over a few months and began behaving like a demon possessed him. He had no remorse, no care, no shred of empathy. All he had left was fire and rage. Arthur went into exile, back to the cave of his apartment on the other side of the river, past the railroad tracks. At first, his friends, family, and business partners sympathized, but after their attempts only resulted in more blow-ups, no one dared to venture back for fear of meeting his wrath. Not even his beloved Mabel could reach him. After she was released from the asylum, she tried, but he was too far gone and she gave up. Her heart broken and confused, Mabel abandoned all she had known, leaving their child with a guardian while she ran away to start a new life in another state. Over the years, Arthur became more set in his ways. He was sinister and abusive, spending many nights running on fumes and booze, sleeping with many women and being volatile. He fathered another baby, and there were rumors of its death at his hand. Arthur was a hateful person with a gigantic presence, a monster. If only he had been taken care of, if only his power had been fostered for good. Now, Arthur was a son of a bitch, and this tale is not meant to put some romanticized spin on his horrific behavior. He was an abusive prick who did a lot of damage. But this story is here to tell you about what happens to dragons when you don't care for them, when you don't engage with them or show them what love is. Dragons become malevolent creatures. A dragon who is loved, respected, and understood by those around them is mercy embodied. So is it nature or nurture that makes them a monster? I say it's both. We can't help but wonder what would have happened to Arthur had he been accepted, if his world had celebrated all of his magic and allowed him to embody that power. How would he have grown if he had learned to wield that fire to create tools and a life worth living instead of his destructive force? The odds were stacked against him, but what would have happened in a better world? Here's the thing though, dragons don't just get born once. They exist in lineages. Every so often another one comes along. Each time it is born, a dragon will come to know themselves and their power as the curse breaker of their lineage. You see, Arthur was my great-grandfather. There have been many times when I've met with mediums and psychics, and they told me to banish him, bind him, and cleanse myself of his bad karma. While he has his lengthy list of shortcomings, and I am aware of the atrocities that he committed, there's something I recognize in him that I see in myself. He still haunts me. I smell the smoke of his cigarettes. I feel his presence invade my space when certain types of music come on. I feel what made him alive and happy to exist. I also know what happens when you're deeply misunderstood and constantly blamed for holding too much energy, when people are scared of you because of what you are capable of. I know the way others try to kill your spirit before you grow up and eat it. It's similar to how humans are obsessed with owning wild creatures and can't understand why they attack when they grow up. As Arthur's descendant, I didn't want to punish him or banish him from my mind. I wanted to free him, and maybe selfishly take on this task because I no longer wanted to be burdened with his karmic debt or the residual damage of his actions. More important, though, I wanted to liberate him because his spirit was negatively trapped and almost bound energetically to his relatives by haunting them through inherited trauma, anger issues, resentment, and pain. All of the wounds he never dealt with or took accountability for, he passed down to his descendants, causing him to continue to wreak havoc on the lives of his living relatives. I wanted to give him one last chance to be seen as a dragon, freed from his mortal form. So instead of banishing him, I made him a meal, a spirit meal I felt like he would like. I sat down on the floor of my studio apartment, as I didn't have a kitchen table at the time, and arranged 2 settings, plate to plate and cup to cup. I set the table and invited him in, not with unconditional love, but with recognition. No one, not since Mabel, has treated him with decency. Why would they? He set it up that way as a means to punish himself. We ate. I thanked him for bestowing this dragon energy on me and opened the pathway through the ethers for him to go. In front of my eyes, he morphed into a golden dragon and went out through the back door, making his way through the sagebrush and up the yucca tree toward the sky until I could see him no more. He left that day, and not a year later, I got my baby dragon in real life, the bearded dragon lizard I call Lord. Over the years, I found my ways to express my dragon energy through performance. I had a few bumps and lessons in the road as I learned how to control my temper when others tried to moderate my size. I was fortunate enough to play in bands a few times in my life, and one show night, one of those bands got to play the stage in the club Arthur formerly owned. Ironically, I only found that out 17 years after the fact. Arthur had been trying to connect with me for years, and I was so engulfed in my own rage that I could not hear him. I still sense my great-grandfather's energy occasionally. He's fiercely protective and respects and loves my artistic life. And while all cannot be forgiven for the pain or wreckage he has caused, it is no longer my job to carry his burden. That task is now on him to rectify. It is no one else's responsibility. No more descendants will be burdened with maintaining the shame of what he has done. As the next dragon in the lineage, it's my responsibility to control my fire and learn how to use it to create tools of love, peace, and healing to manifest a great life, one that he did not have the opportunity to have. It is my responsibility to be my ancestors' wildest dream.
This is a heavy one. I mean, some of them are a little more heavy than others, and definitely want to open up for a few questions if anyone has one. For James or myself, anybody.
Where is Lord right now?
Lord is in Tucson, Arizona, asleep. Thank you for asking about her. She's great.
Anyone else?
Yes. Were there parables that were more readily available to you than others?
Some definitely flowed out of me in ways that it's like they just came out of me. And then I would have, when those ones felt like giant, when like a giant tear or sob comes up and it's just hot. That's the only way I can describe it. Particularly the inescapable fear of drowning. That one came up so hot and so fast and easy. I think I wrote it in 2 hours, and then I couldn't write for a week and a half. And when it wasn't easy to write, I would write more about my own personal self, or I would write an exercise and wait for those stories that wanted to be told to come through. Because I feel like there's probably definitely more things that could have been told, but I didn't want to force it if it wasn't time or right yet.
You say in that piece about the dragon, I also know what happens when you are deeply misunderstood and constantly blamed for holding too much energy, when people are scared of you because of what you're capable of. And I thought that's so powerful because, you know, as an artist who works with women so much of the time, and any woman who's ever been called a bitch is probably my client. You know, I think it's just so much more difficult. Like, I hear it all the time. It's all the time, oh, she's too loud, or she takes up too much space, or, you know, how did you kind of work against those voices that had always told you were too much to finally kind of settle in and say, no, I'm enough, and this is how I'm going to work through all of this?
I mean, I think when you have those voices, you're going to constantly be kind of meeting them, and sometimes they're easier to kind of shoo away. And I think part of me, when it comes to anything that like I create in a way, I have to step aside. Like, I have a lot of therapy and a lot of reminding myself that, you know, other people can tell your story for you, but it's other people, you know? And it's scary. It's scary to be vulnerable. It's scary to tell the world who you are, because I've been a notorious people pleaser, pretending not to be most of my life, you know? Accommodating, very, very accommodating. And then to suddenly not, you start to see people respond to that. And I don't know, I think it's messy and it's practice. And, you know, some people, I envy people who are confident and can clearly show up and not be scared to reveal themselves. But then there are some things that I feel like sure about, and it's my truth I can feel sure about. And I don't know if it's not being small or not being common, it's just truth to me is more valuable in sharing, even if it's spoken quietly.
You say a few chapters later, however, the real issue is that those histories, pacts, my accents come out, pacts, inherited contracts, and historical trauma must be confronted and addressed by someone who has had enough of being haunted by some indeterminate pain that they don't understand because no one in the family ever talked about it. And when I tell you, that was like a, you know, I think we kind of white woman wellness, you know, trauma, the word trauma and, you know, ancestral trauma and kind of like all of that. But I think what you do here is make it so easy to understand and so real and raw in a way that I love the idea of the practice, you know, not being perfect with it. When you are giving people some of these tools that you'll find in the book, you know, what advice do you have for someone who might be saying, well, how do I take the first step, you know?
Well, I mean, it's like definitely like written in there. Like I share like a grounding and protection exercise. There's like spiritual hygiene stuff that you can do. Build an altar, build a space where you can do the work. It doesn't have to be fancy. Get back into your body and being in touch with how you feel without being afraid of what you're feeling. Give yourself the parameters to explore emotion without figuring out how to neatly wipe up any tears or mess. Let yourself, again, like letting yourself be messy in the process. And go slow and take your time. There might be times where you work through it quicker or slower, but I don't think you should put a timestamp on it, or, you know, if there are so many things out there selling you, like, let me fix you in 3 days, or go to this retreat, and like, that's just not what it is. This is decades of, and things, like I said, this is not the end all to be all. This is a starting point. I hope more people write from this lens of not fitting in this way, or maybe there's more offerings, but I definitely don't, I just, like with everything I do, I feel like I'm an instigator. I'm like, I'll start it. I mean, I definitely won't finish it, but I'll start it with everything, you know? So, yeah, you're welcome. But yeah, I don't know, it's, I think the big thing is being curious when you're afraid. That I say in the book as well. Me staying curious when I was afraid has helped me with many things. It's helped me convert kind of and transmute that energy of fear, which can normally suffocate or talk me out of doing something. Being curious is like okay, I can go a little bit further and see what happens. I can share a little bit more. And healthy boundaries. You know, not everybody, you know, you're not supposed to bleed all everyone or, you know, or let other people just suck the life out of you. And it's about finding that balance too. Yeah. All right. Any other questions before we I'll just sign some books. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, James, for talking with me. At the counter, they have books. There's also, I brought some things that I made. There's some art prints that are for sale, different sizes. There's some postcards. And I made these little travel altars. So there's one for abundance and one for protection. And they have like little 3D printouts of a Santissima that I made. And there's Florida water that I made, a little candle, again, they're little pocket altars you can take with you. But yeah, I'll sit up here if you want to come over, or if you ask me anything if you're too shy. Yeah, for a little bit. Thank you.